This isn't the kind of story that starts with a gut feeling or some mysterious phone calls. For years, my wife, let's call her Rachel, and I had what everyone thought was a rock-solid marriage. We've been together for 6 years, married for 4. She's a pharmacist, works long hours at a pharmacy in town, and I'm in construction management. Our lives were simple, busy, and, as far as I could tell, perfectly happy. But sometimes, life throws something at you out of nowhere. I wasn't suspicious of Rachel. Not in the slightest. She was kind, driven, the one who always made sure everything was in order at home. I'd get home from a long day at the site, and she'd be there, asking about my day, telling me about hers, and things just felt right. Then came this one small moment that would change everything. It was a Thursday night. Rachel had been working a lot of late shifts that week, covering for a colleague who'd gone on vacation. Nothing unusual, really, and I didn't think twice about it. I was lying on the couch, watching some random movie, and she walked in the door, tired but smiling, like always. I made her some tea, and we sat down, her talking about some difficult customers and me zoning in and out of her story, just appreciating having her there. Then, just as casually, she mentioned that her phone was dying and asked if she could borrow mine to check something. Nothing strange, she'd borrowed my phone 100 times before. But as she handed it back, I noticed a brief look on her face, just a flicker of something I couldn't quite read. Nervousness? Or maybe guilt? It was gone as soon as it appeared, and Rachel went back to telling me about her day. And that's where it started, the first tiny crack in the facade of our so-called perfect life. After that night, I tried to shake the feeling. It was barely anything, a quick look on her face, gone before I could make sense of it. But once you notice something like that, it's almost impossible to forget. I tried to convince myself I was overthinking it, but something inside me just wouldn't let it go. Over the next few days, I started paying a little more attention, taking note of the small things I'd always dismissed. I noticed Rachel's routine had changed, in ways I couldn't quite put my finger on. She'd always been the type to leave her phone lying around, but now it was glued to her hand or tucked away in her purse. And when I'd come home from work, her usual calm, steady vibe felt different. She was still her cheerful, talkative self, but it was like there was a layer underneath, something guarded, something I couldn't quite reach. One night, we were in the kitchen making dinner together, chopping vegetables, laughing about some silly story I'd heard at work. Her phone buzzed on the counter, and without thinking, she turned it over, face down. The casual way she did it almost went unnoticed, but I couldn't shake that feeling in my gut. She glanced at me with a quick smile, but there was something in her eyes, a flicker of tension, maybe. "You get a lot of work calls after hours these days," I commented, trying to keep it light. She laughed it off. "Yeah, we're short-staffed, so I'm just picking up the slack," she said, shrugging. "It's nothing." I nodded, telling myself to relax. But inside, that doubt grew a little bigger, lingering just below the surface. A week later, that nagging feeling still hadn't gone away. Every small change in Rachel's behavior felt amplified now, her long hours, her phone always close by, the subtle distance that seemed to be growing between us. I kept telling myself to let it go, to stop being paranoid. But there was one evening that would finally push me past that tipping point. Rachel had just left for her night shift, saying goodbye with her usual smile and kiss. After she left, I realized she'd forgotten her lunch on the counter. She'd been so busy that week, running between shifts, that I figured I'd drop it off at the pharmacy and surprise her. So, I grabbed her lunch, threw on my jacket, and drove over to the pharmacy, not even bothering to let her know I was coming. I figured it'd be a nice gesture, maybe break up the routine. When I got there, it was around 8 p.m., and the place was pretty empty, just a few customers milling around. I walked in, scanning the pharmacy, expecting to see her behind the counter, but she wasn't there. I asked one of her coworkers, a woman named Lisa, if Rachel was on break, figuring maybe she'd stepped out for a minute. Lisa looked at me, a little puzzled. Rachel? She left about an hour ago, she said. She mentioned she had to take care of something. I thought she went home. My stomach dropped. Rachel had told me she'd be at work until midnight. If she wasn't here, then where was she? I managed to keep my composure, thanked Lisa, and walked back out to my car. Sitting there in the parking lot, I stared at her untouched lunch bag on the passenger seat, my mind racing. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but my gut was screaming at me, telling me that something was very, very wrong. I drove home, my mind spinning. As I pulled into the driveway, I noticed Rachel's phone charger on the living room table, her laptop still open where she'd left it. My phone buzzed with a text from her, "Just a slow night here, miss you." I sat back, staring at the screen, a cold realization creeping in. She wasn't at work, and she was lying about it. I sat there in the dimly lit living room, my mind racing. Rachel was lying to me. The woman I trusted completely, the one I thought I knew better than anyone else, wasn't where she'd said she'd be. And worse yet, she was covering it up with a casual, "Just a slow night here, miss you." I couldn't let it go. Not now. I needed answers. I grabbed my phone, scrolled through my recent messages with Rachel, and reread her texts from the past few weeks, looking for any clue, any small inconsistency I might have missed. They all read the same, normal messages, nothing out of the ordinary. But that was the problem, they were almost too perfect, too carefully worded. I checked her social media, something I hadn't done in years. There were no new posts from her in weeks. Normally, she'd post a picture from work now and then, or some random meme, but her accounts were quiet. Too quiet. Then, I did something I never thought I'd do. I opened her laptop, still sitting on the coffee table. My heart raced, and I hesitated, feeling like a stranger in my own home. But I pushed through, reminding myself that if she could lie so easily, then maybe I had a right to know what was really going on. It took a few tries, but I guessed her password, our anniversary date, ironic, really. I opened her email first, scrolling through messages quickly, looking for anything that might explain where she was. Work emails, a few messages from friends and family, but nothing seemed unusual, until I opened her sent folder. There it was, a string of emails exchanged with someone named Mike. They weren't too detailed, but they hinted at meetups, our usual spot, and taking care of loose ends. My stomach churned as I read them, putting together the pieces. She'd been careful not to include anything explicit, but it didn't take much to read between the lines. I took a deep breath, fighting the wave of nausea. Who was Mike? And what was our usual spot? I had no idea where she was that night, but now, I knew I had to find out who this guy was. The name Mike was burned into my mind, echoing through every thought as I sat there, staring blankly at Rachel's laptop screen. My mind scrambled to connect the dots, to make sense of the reality I'd just stumbled into. This Mike had somehow slipped into our lives without me noticing, becoming part of her world in a way I never saw coming. As the hours ticked by, I pieced together every detail I could remember. I thought back to those small moments I'd brushed off, how Rachel started coming home later, taking calls in private, guarding her phone. All those times she'd reassured me, brushing off my questions as paranoia. It was all there, hidden in plain sight, but I'd been too trusting, too blind to see it. The next day at work, I found it hard to focus. Every nail I hammered, every board I measured, my mind was somewhere else. My coworker, Brad, noticed I was off and asked if something was up, but I shrugged it off. I wasn't ready to tell anyone. I needed more. I needed to know for certain. During my lunch break, I took a step I never thought I would. I called her pharmacy. My hands were clammy, and my heart pounded as I waited for someone to answer. "Hello, Westridge Pharmacy, this is Karen," a voice answered. I tried to keep my tone casual. "Hi, Karen. I was wondering if Rachel's working today." I couldn't get a hold of her and thought maybe she was busy on shift. There was a pause, then she said, "Oh, Rachel isn't scheduled today. She's actually off until Thursday. She mentioned she had personal errands to take care of." "Right. Got it. Thanks," I said, quickly hanging up. My blood went cold. She'd told me she was working all week, covering for another pharmacist. I knew then that the lies were more than just casual excuses, this was planned, deliberate. I took a deep breath, my mind made up. I needed to see this with my own eyes. That night, I was going to follow her. That evening, I tried to act as normally as possible, hiding my suspicion behind a forced smile. Rachel came home, greeting me like everything was fine, her face a perfect mask of warmth and familiarity. She'd brought dinner, something she rarely did, almost as if she sensed I needed softening up. It felt like a twisted game, her playing the role of a loving wife while I knew that Mike was lingering somewhere in the shadows. After dinner, she mentioned she'd be heading out early the next morning to run a few errands. That was my cue. I nodded, acting nonchalant, knowing this was my chance to see where she'd go, who she'd meet, and finally put an end to my doubts. The next morning, I woke up early, long before her. I parked my car a few blocks down the street, waiting, watching. Sure enough, around 7 a.m., she walked out, dressed in casual clothes, with no mention of the typical pharmacy coat or bag. She didn't see me as she got into her car and pulled out of the driveway, her face as composed as always. I followed her, keeping a safe distance, watching as she took an unexpected turn onto the highway, heading in the opposite direction from the pharmacy. My heart pounded as I gripped the steering wheel, my stomach a twisted knot of anticipation and dread. She finally pulled into the parking lot of a small coffee shop at the edge of town, a place she'd never mentioned to me before. I parked across the street, hidden behind a line of parked cars, and waited, hoping for a clear view of what would happen next. Moments later, a man got out of a silver sedan and walked over to Rachel. He was tall, fit, with an easy smile and an air of familiarity as he approached her. She smiled back, looking more at ease with him than I'd seen her with me in weeks. My pulse thundered in my ears as they exchanged a quick hug. It was casual, but somehow more intimate than I could handle. This was it. This was Mike. I watched as they walked inside together, chatting like two people with no secrets, no reason to hide. My world felt like it was tilting. Seeing them together made everything real in a way I hadn't prepared for. She wasn't just lying, she was creating an entirely different life, with him. I gripped the door handle, fighting the urge to storm inside and confront them right then and there. But I stopped myself. I needed more than anger. I needed proof, something undeniable that would shatter every excuse she could come up with. I took a deep breath, watching as they sat together by the window, laughing over coffee like a couple with nothing to hide. As I sat in my car, staring at them through the coffee shop window, a mix of rage and disbelief took hold of me. Rachel and Mike looked far too comfortable, completely at ease, sharing smiles and laughs that I hadn't seen from her in a long time. My mind raced, but I knew I had to keep my cool. Charging in there, confronting them in the middle of a public cafe, would just give her room to twist the story, to claim it was a harmless meetup or that I was just overreacting. I needed concrete proof, something irrefutable. I pulled out my phone and snapped a few photos of them together, careful to stay hidden. Each shot felt like a dagger, every smile she gave him twisting the knife deeper. This was the woman I thought I knew, someone I'd trusted completely, and here she was, creating a world of secrets behind my back. After about 30 minutes, they left the cafe and walked back toward the parking lot, still chatting, still completely oblivious to my presence. They leaned in, talking closely, too closely, and exchanged one last smile before parting ways. Rachel got back in her car, heading in the direction of home, probably thinking she'd slipped away without leaving a trace. But I had the evidence now, a stack of photos that would speak louder than any excuse she could give. I followed her car back at a safe distance, watching her pull into the driveway and enter our home, her expression casual, completely unbothered by the reality she'd been hiding from me. When I got home that evening, I sat quietly in the living room, waiting for Rachel to come back from her errands. My mind was swirling, my pulse pounding. I'd seen her with him, Mike, the man she'd slipped away with so effortlessly, and I had the photos to prove it. But part of me still wanted to hear her explanation, as twisted as it might be. As I sat there, the silence felt suffocating. Then, suddenly, my phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. Confused, I opened it. It was a video file. For a second, I hesitated. But something urged me to press play. The screen lit up, and my breath caught in my throat. The video showed Rachel, unmistakably, in a dimly lit room. And with her was the same man from the cafe, Mike. My stomach twisted as I watched her laugh, wrapping her arms around him. They were in bed, tangled together in a way that left no room for doubt. I felt a surge of nausea, my hands gripping the phone so tightly I thought it might shatter. Rachel wasn't just lying or sneaking around, she was fully entangled with this guy, living out something that she tried to keep hidden from me. Every last shred of denial I'd held on to crumbled as I watched her, so carefree, so at ease. This wasn't some one-off mistake or moment of weakness. This was deliberate. As the video ended, I sat there, staring at the screen, feeling a cold numbness wash over me. When Rachel finally walked through the door minutes later, smiling as if everything was perfectly normal, I knew this would be the last time she'd see me that way. I was done waiting for answers. I already had them. When Rachel walked through the door, she smiled at me like everything was perfectly normal, her face relaxed and unsuspecting. But the sight of her, after everything I'd seen, sent a surge of anger through me that I couldn't hold back. "Pack your things," I said, my voice harsh and louder than I'd intended. She froze, the smile fading instantly as she looked at me, confused. "What? Matt, what's going on?" "Pack your things," I repeated, my voice cold. "And get out." She blinked, clearly caught off guard, her eyes widening in shock. "Matt, what are you talking about? Why are you acting like this?" I held up my phone, the video still fresh in my mind, and met her gaze with a stare that left no room for negotiation. "We're done, Rachel. You can leave, and don't bother trying to explain. I don't want to hear a word of it. We'll sort everything out in court. Trust me, you'll understand soon enough." A flash of uncertainty crossed her face, her confusion giving way to a flicker of fear. She paused, her hands gripping her purse tightly. "You're serious? Court? You think you have something on me?" I didn't answer, just stared at her, waiting for her to realize she had no way out. She snorted, rolling her eyes in an attempt to hide her discomfort. "Fine, Matt. If you're that desperate, we'll meet in court. Since you're so brave." She tossed her head, forcing a smirk that didn't quite reach her eyes. But I saw the uncertainty, the crack in her confidence. Without another word, I watched her walk upstairs, her steps slower than usual. She still didn't know everything I had on her, but she would soon enough. And this time, she wouldn't be able to talk her way out of it. I knew Rachel wouldn't go down without a fight. After she left that night, I hired a lawyer immediately, laying out everything I had, the photos, the messages, the video. My lawyer assured me it was more than enough to make our case, but he warned me that Rachel could be ruthless and would probably try anything to turn the tables. Sure enough, the day of the first hearing arrived, and Rachel walked in with a confidence that felt unsettling. She looked calm, almost smug, as if the whole thing were just an inconvenience she'd soon brush off. Her lawyer was just as smug, carrying a folder packed with documents, which he handed to the judge with an easy confidence that made me uneasy. As the proceedings began, Rachel's lawyer took the floor, not wasting a moment before launching into a story I hadn't seen coming. "Your Honor," he began, his tone slick and overly professional, "we have evidence suggesting that the breakdown of this marriage began with Mr. Matthews' own infidelities." He slid several documents forward, evidence supposedly proving that I had been the unfaithful one. I could feel the room close in around me as he presented fake receipts for dinners and hotel stays, each supposedly pointing to affairs that I had had over the past year. Then he dropped the bombshell, a series of fabricated text messages, filled with messages supposedly between me and some other woman. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Rachel had gone so far as to fabricate an entire narrative of my infidelity to paint herself as the victim. My lawyer glanced at me, his brow furrowing with concern. The judge leaned forward, carefully reading each evidence item Rachel's team had presented. I wanted to stand up, to yell that it was all a lie, but I held my ground, trusting my lawyer's advice to stay calm. When it was my lawyer's turn, he pointed out the inconsistencies, but the judge seemed hesitant. The fake evidence had rattled him, and he called for a recess, giving us time to gather more proof of the deception. As we stepped outside the courtroom, I felt the weight of everything Rachel had done pressing down on me. My lawyer put a hand on my shoulder. "We'll prove it, Matt. She's going too far, and we'll catch her in her own lies. Let's regroup and get the real evidence we need." I nodded, swallowing the anger and frustration boiling inside me. Rachel had pushed this too far, and now I was more determined than ever to expose the truth. After the first hearing, I was fuming. Rachel's audacity knew no bounds. She had fabricated an entire web of lies, painting me as the unfaithful one. But my lawyer wasn't about to let it slide. He told me we needed to go after the source of that fake evidence. If we could expose the lies, it would destroy her case and show the court exactly what kind of person Rachel really was. My lawyer went to work, tracking down the so-called witness who had provided Rachel's lawyer with the fabricated text messages and receipts. It turned out to be an acquaintance of Rachel's, someone she'd known through a mutual friend. They weren't just helping her out of loyalty, Rachel had paid them off to back up her story. The acquaintance, a guy named Adam, had provided false testimony, creating an entirely fake paper trail to support Rachel's claims. We gathered everything: bank transfers showing payments from Rachel to Adam, timestamps proving that I was nowhere near the places listed in the fake receipts, and statements from colleagues who vouched for my whereabouts during the supposed dates of my affairs. With this new information in hand, we felt prepared for the second trial. The day of the second hearing arrived, and this time, I walked into that courtroom with a renewed sense of purpose. Rachel's confidence had faltered slightly, I could see it in the way she glanced over at me, as if wondering what we had uncovered. The judge opened the hearing, his face impassive as Rachel's lawyer presented the same argument again, pointing to my infidelity as the cause of our marital breakdown. But this time, my lawyer was ready. He stood, calm and collected, and approached the bench. "Your Honor," he began, his voice steady, "we have substantial evidence to prove that the claims made by Mrs. Matthews' team are entirely fabricated." He presented the documentation, starting with the payment records showing Rachel's financial transactions with Adam. My lawyer explained how Rachel had paid Adam to create false evidence and testify against me. Then, he submitted the statements from my colleagues, all corroborating my whereabouts on the dates in question, which directly contradicted the so-called proof of my alleged infidelity. The judge's face darkened as he reviewed the documents, his expression shifting from curiosity to frustration. He looked over at Rachel's lawyer, his voice firm. "Mr. Thompson," he said, addressing her lawyer, "this is highly concerning. You presented false evidence to this court, and it appears your client has manipulated the judicial process in an attempt to undermine Mr. Matthews' credibility." Rachel's lawyer looked flustered, stumbling over his words, but he couldn't deny the evidence. The judge turned to Rachel, his gaze stern. "Mrs. Matthews, this is a serious offense. Your actions have not only misled this court but have also wasted time and resources. I am officially recording this attempted deception in the case file, and it will weigh heavily on any future proceedings. Rachel's face went pale as the judge marked down her lies in the court records, a permanent stain on her credibility. I sat back, feeling a sense of relief. Her lies had been exposed, and with them, her attempt to ruin me was finally falling apart. The third trial was the one I'd been waiting for, the day everything Rachel had hidden, all the lies and betrayal, would finally be exposed. I arrived early, my lawyer by my side, feeling a strange mix of anger and relief. Today, there would be no twisted narratives, no fake evidence. Today, we had the truth, and nothing could shield her from it. Rachel entered the courtroom, her face unreadable, but I could see a faint hint of anxiety behind her calm exterior. She glanced over at me, and for the first time, her confident smirk was gone. Maybe she sensed that things weren't going to go her way this time. The judge opened the hearing, turning to my lawyer. "Mr. Avery, please present your evidence." My lawyer rose, straightening his papers as he began. "Your Honor, we have undeniable proof of Mrs. Matthews' infidelity and deception. Today, we'll be showing the court the extent of her betrayal, evidence she can't dismiss or deny." He started with the photos, the images I'd taken that day outside the cafe, showing Rachel meeting with Mike, looking every bit the carefree partner she hadn't been with me in months. The judge looked through the images silently, his expression hardening as he pieced together the picture we were painting. Next, my lawyer presented the text messages, showing their meetups, their coded exchanges about their usual spot, and all the lies she'd told me to cover her tracks. The courtroom was dead silent, the weight of the truth filling the air. Finally, my lawyer announced, "And, Your Honor, we have one more piece of evidence. A video that removes any shadow of doubt regarding Mrs. Matthews' actions." At that, Rachel's face drained of color. Her eyes widened slightly as she looked at her lawyer, but he sat frozen, unprepared for what was coming. My lawyer played the video, the one I'd received, showing Rachel and Mike in a setting so intimate, so unambiguously clear, that no amount of excuses could twist it into anything innocent. The courtroom was silent, save for the faint sounds of the video playing on the screen. I couldn't bear to look at it again, but I glanced at Rachel. Her face had turned deathly pale, her expression one of absolute horror as she realized her carefully crafted lies were unraveling in real time, in front of the judge and everyone present. Then, as the seconds passed, a red flush crept over her cheeks, a mixture of humiliation and anger as she finally understood that there was no way out. When the video ended, the silence that followed was deafening. The judge looked up, his gaze piercing as he spoke. "Mrs. Matthews, the evidence presented here today leaves no doubt about your actions. You have not only betrayed the trust of your husband but have also manipulated this court with deceitful claims. This behavior is unacceptable and will be reflected in the final ruling." Rachel's lawyer stammered, trying to salvage whatever he could, but there was nothing left to argue. The evidence was irrefutable, and her lies had crumbled to dust. I looked over at Rachel one last time, watching her as she sat there, no longer the confident woman who thought she could control everything. She'd gambled everything and lost, and the truth had left her with nothing. The day of the final verdict arrived, and I walked into the courtroom knowing that this chapter of my life was about to close. Rachel was already there, sitting beside her lawyer, looking far from the confident woman who had once tried to turn the tables on me. Her face was tense, her shoulders slumped. She knew as well as I did that there was no more hiding, no more games. The judge entered, and everyone rose. He settled into his chair, reviewing the notes and evidence one last time before delivering the verdict. The silence was thick, every eye in the room focused on him as he began to speak. After reviewing the evidence presented in this case, the judge said, his voice steady and resolute, "This court finds sufficient grounds to grant Mr. Matthews' request for divorce on the basis of adultery and fraud." I exhaled, feeling a wave of relief, the weight of this long ordeal finally lifting. But the judge wasn't finished. He turned his gaze to Rachel, who visibly shrank under his stern look. Mrs. Matthews, this court is deeply troubled by your actions throughout these proceedings. Not only did you engage in extramarital relations, but you also knowingly fabricated evidence, submitted false testimonies, and attempted to mislead this court to damage Mr. Matthews' reputation. This behavior constitutes an abuse of the legal process, wasting the court's time and resources. Rachel looked down, her face a mix of shock and shame, no longer able to meet the judge's gaze. Her lawyer sat in silence, knowing there was nothing left to say. As a consequence, the judge continued, in addition to finalizing this divorce with full asset protection awarded to Mr. Matthews, this court will impose a penalty upon you, Mrs. Matthews, for attempting to deceive the court. You are hereby ordered to pay a substantial fine to cover all court and legal fees incurred by Mr. Matthews, as well as an additional penalty for contempt of court due to falsified evidence. Rachel's face turned pale again, her hands trembling as the reality of the punishment set in. She had tried to take everything from me, only to find herself facing the consequences of her own lies and manipulation. And finally, the judge said, "This ruling will be documented in the court record as an instance of perjury and fraud, which may have lasting effects on your credibility in any future legal matters." With a final bang of the gavel, the judge concluded the trial. It was over. The divorce was official, my reputation was restored, and Rachel's deceit had cost her everything she tried to take from me. As I walked out of the courtroom, I felt an overwhelming sense of freedom. Rachel had gambled and lost, left to deal with the mess she had created. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could finally move forward, free of her lies and betrayal, ready to start a new chapter on my own terms. After the judge's ruling, I thought I'd feel a sense of closure. But knowing how hard Rachel had tried to ruin me, I felt there was one more thing left undone. She'd deceived me, manipulated the court, and shattered what was left of our marriage, and all of it without a hint of remorse. Her reputation had taken a hit in court, but I knew Rachel would continue on as though nothing had happened if she could. I wasn't going to give her that satisfaction. Rachel worked as a pharmacist, and the pharmacy had always prided itself on integrity and trust. But what kind of person did they really have behind the counter? Someone who not only lied and betrayed but also falsified court documents and bribed witnesses. I decided they needed to know exactly who was representing them. I took copies of the court records, every ruling, every instance of false testimony, every documented lie. With those records, I also gathered the public transcript detailing the perjury charge and Rachel's blatant manipulation of the legal process. It was all right there in black and white, undeniable evidence of her dishonesty and her willingness to do whatever it took to get her way, regardless of the ethical or legal boundaries she crossed. One afternoon, I went to her pharmacy, requesting a private meeting with her manager. I could tell he was caught off guard but agreed, curious as to why I'd want to speak with him directly. I sat across from him, his office calm and organized, qualities I once associated with Rachel, back before I knew her true character. I slid the documents across the desk. "I thought you should know who you have behind your counter." He looked through the papers, his expression growing darker with each passing page. He shifted uncomfortably, clearly disturbed by the evidence of Rachel's behavior. "This is shocking, to say the least," he said, his voice low and careful. "I had no idea." "Neither did I replied, the bitterness still lingering. "But I thought you deserved to know. She represents your business, and I don't think her actions reflect the integrity you expect from your team." He nodded, closing the folder and setting it down with a heavy sigh. "Thank you for bringing this to my attention. We'll be conducting a thorough review." I left the pharmacy that day feeling a sense of justice, knowing Rachel's actions would finally catch up to her. Within a week, I heard from a mutual acquaintance that Rachel was no longer employed at the pharmacy. She'd lost her job, her reputation was tarnished, and any future employer would see her name marked by legal infractions and dishonesty. She had tried to ruin me, but in the end, her deceit and manipulation only served to ruin herself. I was free, finally able to move on with my life, while Rachel faced the consequences of every lie she'd told, every line she'd crossed. And with that, I closed the last chapter on a life I'd once thought was mine. With the divorce finalized and Rachel's lies fully exposed, life finally started looking up for me. It was strange, at first, to live without the weight of her betrayal lingering in the back of my mind, but as the days passed, I felt lighter, more free. Work was steady, and I'd reconnected with friends who'd supported me through this ordeal. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was moving forward. But for Rachel, things were falling apart. After being let go from the pharmacy, she struggled to find another job. Word had spread, both professionally and personally, about the lengths she had gone to try to destroy me. When potential employers looked her up, the court records of perjury and contempt stood as a stark reminder of her dishonesty. Doors were closing fast, and her once solid reputation was gone. As if that wasn't enough, her lover, Mike, had disappeared. Whether he was avoiding the fallout or was simply unwilling to deal with the mess Rachel had created, he'd cut ties completely. Friends and even some family had distanced themselves from her, unwilling to be associated with someone who'd shown such deceitful and destructive behavior. She was isolated, her life unraveling in the aftermath of her own choices. Then, one afternoon, there was a knock at my door. I opened it to find Rachel standing there, her face twisted in anger and frustration. She looked worn down, nothing like the confident woman I'd once known. Without a word, she stormed in, her eyes blazing. "This is all your fault," she spat, her voice trembling with rage. "You ruined everything, you destroyed my life." I let her words hang in the air for a moment, letting her see that her anger had no effect on me anymore. Calmly, I looked her in the eye and said, "Rachel, the only person responsible for this mess is you. You lied, you betrayed me, and you tried to manipulate everyone around you. Everything that's happening to you now is a result of your own actions." She opened her mouth to argue, but no words came out. Her expression softened briefly, as if she might finally see the truth, but then her anger returned, and she turned to leave. As she walked out the door, I realized that this was truly the end, the final goodbye. Rachel was left to face the consequences of her choices, while I was finally free to live my life without the shadow of her deceit. For the first time, I felt at peace, ready to build a future that was truly my own.